as a Platonist, I sort of approach Aristotle with caution and apprehension, but I mean, he is always impressive when one comes to grips with him. In this case, I suppose this is a talk. It's a subject I have dealt with before, actually, but there's only a limited number of subjects relative to this conference that I could talk about. Syrianus being the other, I suppose. But I think with this, we're approaching the great problem for Platonists, the later Platonists, from Porphyry on, in a way, sort of what to do about Aristotle. Because if we follow Lloyd Gerson, for instance, Aristotle was a Platonist, and they were always together, but it was not obvious, obviously. And of course, the nub of the question of what to do about Aristotle, I think, relates to the categories. Either you shoot them down, attack them, take them apart, as Plotinus does, although he's more positive, I think, than he had generally been regarded as, but he's inheriting a tradition. Or with Porphyry, you accept that they are a valid, reasonably good tool for analyzing the physical world, but you can go further than that. And that's where Iamblichus comes in, I think, with his higher interpretation. And that's what we're going to explore today. As we know, for many generations of Platonist and indeed Stoic philosophers, Aristotle's system of categories, or modes of predication of physical reality, provided a ready target for criticism. Indeed, ever since Andronicus of Rhodes published the Organon, in whatever sense he did that, and I'm conscious of Jonathan Barnes's very, very entertaining speculations about that, critiques have been directed against the categories by members of both the Platonist and Stoic schools, intent on undermining Aristotle's claim to have correctly divided up either language or reality. Extensive debate had been conducted both as to the true subject matter, the skopos, of the work, whether words, things, or concepts, or ultimately in Porphyry's comprehensive formulation, simple words significatory of things insofar as they are significatory, semantica, but not insofar as they are simply utterances. And as to how useful or accurate Aristotle's division into 10 modes of predication actually is. By the time of Plotinus, the issues for Platonists relative to the categories seem to have become the following. First of all, to what level of reality can Aristotle's categories be regarded as relating? The material, or also the intelligible? And secondly, assuming they relate only to material reality, what might be the categories proper to the intelligible world? There have to be some. In Ennead 6:1-3, on the kinds of being, Plotinus, first in 6:1, takes the Aristotelian categories as having relevance only to the material realm and criticizes them as such, drawing extensively on the previous critiques of such figures as Lucius and Nicostratus, and of course Cornutus and Athenodorus and whatever. And then turning to the intelligible realm in 6:2, seeks to apply to the structuring of that the 5 greatest kinds, megasthegene, of Plato's sophist. And lastly, in 6:3, he turns back to the material world and applies to that a modified version of the Aristotelian categories. Really projections of the megasthegene, but fitting in with some of the categories. Rather grudgingly, I suppose. From this, we can at least gather that for Plotinus, albeit with some reservations, the Aristotelian categories are acceptable as structural principles for the material realm. And this position is adopted in a rather more positive mode by his pupil Porphyry, both in his surviving short commentary in question and answer form, and in his big commentary dedicated to Gedalius, which has perished, but which is in fact largely recoverable from Simplicus. However, Porphyry in his surviving works does not address the question of a suitable set of categories for the intelligible world, I think. He probably accepted Plotinus' suggestion of the megastegenia of the sophist. The question remains, is there any role for the 10 Aristotelian categories at the level of intelligible reality? This is the question addressed by Porphyry's dissident pupil, Iamblichus of Chalcis, in his commentary on the categories. I dealt with this topic previously, I have to confess, some years ago, but I return to it now, fortified by some further reflection, and the additional resource of the annotated translation of Simplicus' commentary in the ancient commentators on Aristotle. This is a series, that great service. Simplicus, as I've noted in my previous discussion, is engagingly frank about his dependence on the work of his predecessors, particularly the commentaries of Porphyry and Iamblichus, and correspondingly modest about his own contribution. I quote some relevant passages. First, from the beginning of the commentary, page 209, and we have these in the handout, where he has just been discussing Porphyry. He now moves on from him to describe the distinctive contribution of Iamblichus. Following on him, as I say Porphyry, the divine Iamblichus also devoted a lengthy commentary to this book, for the most part following the work of Porphyry even to the extent of verbatim borrowing. This passage is what discouraged me from trying to make a collection of the fragments of his commentary, because I decided when all is said and done, they're not lost, really. Where would you stop? Anyway, verbatim catalects him, but in some cases criticizing and more clearly elucidating him, while at the same time compressing his scholastic long-windedness in the refutation of objections. And throughout the work, superimposing upon more or less every section the intellectual interpretation, the noera theoria of the subject matter, as well as adding to the work another element, over and above these, that is useful. For seeing that Archytas the Pythagorean had made the division into 10 primary genera in his work on the universe, he incorporated it into his commentary. And of course, in the surviving commentary of Simplicus, Archytas is constantly brought in. Then, just to confirm any impression we might form that the great bulk of Simplicus' commentary is derived from his predecessors, he adds a little later the following modest disclaimer in the next page. If I have been able to add anything at all, that's to the work of my predecessors, for this I give thanks, after the gods, to these men, under whose guidance it is that I have raised any points worthy of acceptance, or contributed any elucidations worthy of note. I would, however, urge all those who take up this book never to disregard the writings of Iamblichus and Porphyry in favor of these annotations of mine, but to use my work, if at all, merely as an introduction and a practical exercise for the more accurate understanding of their utterances. One cannot help but like Simplicus. We're unable, alas, to take his advice. So we must do the best we can with what he has transmitted to us, which I suggest is most of what they wrote. The incorporation of Archytas by Iamblichus into the commentary is indeed a distinctive contribution, consonant with Iamblichus' strong Neo-Pythagorean bias, and enables us to identify Iamblichian elements in Simplicus' text that are not otherwise explicitly acknowledged. But on this occasion I'm concerned only with the imposition of the noera theoria, or intellectual interpretation, on what might seem at first sight the rather unpromising text of the categories. One can actually observe, I think, some development along such lines even in Plotinus. In 6.3, the last part of the great treatise on the kinds of being, he makes some effort to work out how the categories that he's discerned as structuring principles of the intelligible realm, which are in fact the 5 greatest kinds, might be projected upon the sense world, and comes up with some interesting suggestions. This is a far cry, certainly, from the exercise that Iamblichus is engaged upon with the categories, but it does at least indicate a concern by Plotinus to establish a connection, albeit of the paradigm image variety, between the structuring of higher reality and that of the lower material realm. Well, basically, Plotinus is looking downwards from the intelligible realm, as he often does, and Iamblichus is looking upwards. At any rate, the postulation of an analogical reflection of the higher on the lower was Iamblichus's chosen strategy for saving the Aristotelian categories. Before looking at a number of examples of how this strategy works out, however, we might consider a preliminary remark by Simplicus that seems to me to fit very well with Iamblichus's overall position. Actually, in view of what we were talking about last session, I think it relates to the question of whether you can define a form or an idea. This concerns the role of language in general and of predicative utterances in particular at lower levels of reality, whereas they would not be needed at the level of intellect. It seems to me to express rather well what would have been Iamblichus's rationale for discerning analogues of the Aristotelian categories at higher levels of being. So on the categories, page 1219 to 13.4. As for the soul, when it is converted towards intellect, it possesses the same things as intellect, in a secondary way. For then the rational principles, the logoi within it, are not only cognitive but generative. So they produce, yes. Once, however, genematikoi, I think. Once, however, the soul has departed from there, let's say the intelligible world, it also separates the formula, the logoi within itself, from beings, thereby converting them into images instead of prototypes. And it introduces a distance between intellection and realities. There's soul in its lower aspect, or lower directed aspect. This is all the more true the further the soul has departed from its similarity to intellect, and it's henceforth content to project proballastai, notions which are consonant with realities. So at that point you can get definitions, among other things, I think. When, however, the soul has fallen into the realm of becoming, it is filled with forgetfulness and requires sight and hearing in order to be able to recollect. So therefore you recover, I suppose, the universals and so on that way. For the soul needs someone who has already beheld the truth, who by means of language, phone, uttered forth from the concept, the anoia, also moves the concept within the soul of the student, which until then had grown cold. This then is how the need for language came about. On the one hand, it strives immediately to assimilate itself to notions, to noemata, while on the other, by means of them, it adjusts to realities and becomes of one nature with them, in order that words, phonai, might not be uttered at random, maten, as in the case of bliteri, the great example of the meaningless word, but might rather set in motion within the listener those notions which are similar to the kinetic motions, let's say the noemata within the mind of the teacher. For intellections, noeses, which proceed forth from other intellections, also stimulate motion immediately. And they join the learner's notions to those of the teacher. That's where they become kinetic. Yes? By becoming intermediaries, mesothetes, between the two. When intellections are set in motion in an appropriate way, they adjust themselves to realities, and thus there comes about the knowledge of beings. The soul's spontaneous desire, its eros, is fulfilled. Well, now, I'd like to think that that was Iamblichus, the sort of thing he should have said, but it's not credited to him, I think, because Simplicus entirely agrees with it. One may conclude from this, I think, that the Iamblichian rationale for the existence of a system of categories at the level of the sense world is the need for discursive reasoning, such as is not required at the intelligible level of reality, and the categorization of an application of predicates to physical objects. While nonetheless analogues of these categories are present in archetypal form at the higher levels of reality. Let's look at how this theory works out in a selection of instances. We may begin, as is appropriate, with substance. Iamblichus takes his start, as is generally the case, from an aporia, generated originally in all probability by the indefatigable Lucius and Nicostratus, but taken up also by Plotinus in Ennead 6:1-15 following. As to whether Aristotle's definition in chapter 5 of substance as that which, being numerically one and the same, is able to receive contraries, really identifies an essential attribute of substance, or simply an accidental one. For one thing, is it applicable to intelligible as well as to sensible matter? For another, is it even applicable to the substances of the heavenly regions, or to such substances as fire or snow? Good examples of things that can't entertain their opposites by remaining fire or snow. The first line of response to this, as relayed by Iamblichus' pupil Dexipus in his short commentary, page 57-18 following, which presumably reflects the views of his master, although Dexipus certainly on Simplicus' evidence also used for most of his commentary Porphyry, because it's an elementary commentary. Reflect the views is that Aristotle is only here concerned with sublunary physical substance, and should not be held to be defining the essence of eternal simple substances as well. Further, as regards the heavenly bodies and fire and snow, such characteristics as circular motion or heat and cold cannot count as one of a pair of contrary qualities, as they're essential to the composition of those bodies. So they're more than just qualities according to the act. However, Iamblichus does not stop there, but raises the argument to a higher plane, as Simplicus remarks, on more Pythagorean lines, Pythagorikuteron. He professes, by the employment of analogical reasoning, the analogian, to discern the coexistence of contraries on the level of intelligible substance as well, to wit, motion and rest, sameness and otherness, the very megasthegeny of the sophist, which Plotinus in Ennead 6:2 adopted as the categories of the intelligible world. The only difference, Iamblichus maintains, in Simplicus 116:29 following, is that on the intelligible plane, the contraries are present not successively, but simultaneously. He goes on to discern the coexistence of contraries, so of course motion and rest are in a way coexistent in being and so forth. He goes on to discern the coexistence of contraries also in the substance of the heavenly bodies, the distinction from the intelligible realm being that there the contraries coexist in a simple entity, while in the celestial realm they exist in different parts at different times. At the lowest level, however, which is the physical, the opposites can be present only alternately. This passage is a good example, I think, of the Noera Theoria at work. Iamblichus' focus of interest is ontological rather than logical, and he is concerned to isolate the same feature, in this case the ability to receive contraries, as manifested analogically at various levels of reality. This property of substance is common to every level of substance. To idioma tuto tesousias koinon kata pasanousian, he declares, 118:2. If we turn now to the category of quantity, Iamblichus' argument in favor of classing weight, rope, as a third type of quantity, along with megathos and plethos, representing continuous and discrete quantity, respectively. That's to say, one can have measurements of weight, such as a mina or a talent, as well as those of size or number, is another interesting example of his method. Say, Simplicus 128:16 following. The original aporia, complaining that Aristotle had not listed rope as a third type, belongs as usual to Lucius and Nicostratus, though the commendation of Archytas as having included rope may be due to Iamblichus, well, almost certainly due to Iamblichus actually. But it's what he makes of it that concerns us here. What he in fact does is to relate this to his ontology by making a distinction between weighted and weightless quantities at various levels of reality. The four elements have relative weight and lightness, as against the heaven, which is weightless. Circular. Among types of motion, the rectilinear ones involve weight, as against the circular, which is weightless. Repes. And then, rising to the level of immaterial essence, the soul, which has an inclination, rope, towards what is below it, or above it, can be characterized as possessing both weight and lightness, spiritual weight and lightness, as against the intelligible realm, which is unaffected by such inclinations and is thus devoid of inclination. It's arrepes. A little further on, Iamblichus gives us his Noera theoria of the fact that of quantities, some are discrete and others continuous. I quote here, "Since the power of the one, from which all quantity derives, extends alike through all things, and demarcates each thing in its procession from itself, insofar as it penetrates totally indivisibly through all things, it generates the continuous. And insofar as it performs a single and indivisible procession without interval." So that's its sort of emanation to all levels. Whereas insofar as it halts its procession at each of the forms and defines each and makes each of them one, which is also something that at least the one provokes, I suppose, through intellect, in this aspect it produces the discrete. So in virtue of being the single dominant causal principle of these two activities, it produces two types of quantity. So therefore, the one is, in a way, in a Cartesian way, is the principle responsible for continuous and discrete quantities. He continues this line of thought for some while longer, linking the two classes of quantity in the universe in various ways with the processive and the static aspects of the one, ending with the following interesting remark. "For the potency of the intelligible measurements comprises at the same time both the remaining and the processive elements in one and the same entity. For which reason, if one attributes just one or the other of these to the intelligible and divine measurement, in the case of assigning the unmoving ones alone, one becomes deceived by the errors of the peripatetics, and in the case of the processive ones, by that of the Stoics. Well, he thus satisfactorily puts both the chief rivals of Platonism in their place, criticizing on the one hand the unmoved mover of Aristotle, and on the other hand the dynamic active principle of the Stoics. The Noera theoria here consists in identifying the characteristics of being discrete or continuous as aspects of the power of the one, active at every level of reality, and thus gives a metaphysical underpinning to the rather bald and unpretentious text of Aristotle. It also furthers another constant aim of Iamblichus in his exegesis, which is to emphasize the unity underlying each category, something that was regularly challenged by hostile critics from Cornutus through Lucius and Nicostratus to Plotinus. They try to pick the categories apart. With regard to the category of relative, Iamblichus would seem to have had quite a lot to say on matters of detail, and he's on record as defending Aristotle's distinction of the varieties of relativity, Simplicus 162, 116 following, but Simplicus provides no evidence of any intellectual exegesis of this category, and at the end of his discussion, I think we can learn why. 205.22 following. We should realize that many of the genera are strictly among perceptibles and not among intelligibles, unless one is forced to transfer them by some other mode across to the intelligibles, these intelligibles. Just like posture and affection, that's to say passivity. Let the relative be one of these. So I don't have anything to say in Noera theory about that. For no relationship is even so much as conceived up there. For where one thing is not in something else, as relationship is in substance, and there is no one thing in another in such a way as to be relatively disposed, how is it possible to consider relative strictly in their case, except by analogy? Just as we say that up there are causes and effects. We might venture to conclude from this, then, that Iamblichus was prepared to accept that not all Aristotelian categories can be given an intelligible analogue. This is not so, well, unless Simplicus, unless he gave an explanation of relative so bizarre that Simplicus simply gives up on it, but I don't think that would be the case. This is not so with the next category, that of quality. We may turn next to a long passage of Simplicus's commentary, 216, 6 to 219, 35, in which Iamblichus presents an account of the more intellectual causal principles, the noeroterai aitiai of quality. His aim here is to establish the substantial existence of qualities as objectively existing logoi in the universe, as against the criticism voiced by Plotinus, among others, then in 6.110, that quality is a kind of non-substantial characteristic, the characteritis huc usiodes. With this aim in view, he turns first to a critique of those who hold various unsound views about quality. In quite an elaborate doxography, he isolates 5 classes of thinkers who offend in this way, beginning with the Eretrian school, then Dicæarchus and Theopompus, who deny any substantial existence to qualities, proceeding through a second anonymous group to the atomists and Epicureans, proceeding to a third, academics, and finally Stoics, who take all qualities as material states of pneuma, all of whom exhibit in one way or another an inadequate grasp of the concept of quality. He then turns to the commendation of Aristotle's own doctrine, which he describes as admirable, thaumasia, since he declares qualities to be immaterial logoi. How he can possibly derive this doctrine from chapter 8 of the Categories is explained by the fact that he is able to adduce the corresponding section of the Metaphysics. So it's explaining Aristotle through Aristotle. 4.14, 10.20a, 33 following, where quality is discussed from a somewhat different angle. Porphyry had already remarked in Simplicus 2.13.10 following that the account of quality in the Categories is ennoematikos, by which he seems to mean something like subjective or reflecting people's concepts, as opposed to that given in the Metaphysics, which is ousiodes, objective, or reflecting substantial reality. For Iamblichus, it would seem both expositions of quality are concordant and ousiodes. He takes Aristotle's formulation, a quality is that in virtue of which things are said to be qualified, poios, poioi, as a recognition that qualities are logoi which impose form on, edo poiusun, qualified things. And he links this with Aristotle's first definition of quality in Metaphysics Gamma as the differentia, the diaphora of primary being. It's the peculiarity of qualities both to possess real existence, hypostasis, and to exercise that existence inseparably from the matter they are qualifying. They are thus immanent logoi, not transcendent forms. On the other hand, he distinguishes qualities from what he calls the reason principles inherent in the shape, hokataten morphein logos, 2.19.10, which he characterizes as something lifeless and devoid of activity, apsikos and energetos. I presume that by this he means simply the structural proportions or other visible features of an object, which supervene on the imposition of quality by the logos in question. He only mentions this latter entity because, although Aristotle, he claims, distinguishes these senses of logos, many people confuse them. Again, and in Cat 271.6 following, we're given what Simplicus calls Iamblichus's theorikoteroi epistasis, his more theoretical interpretation of the fourth class of qualities, that is, shape and the external form of each thing. Schema to kai hyperhekaston hyparkusa morphe, set out by Aristotle at Categories 10a, 11 to 26. Here Iamblichus takes his start from the observation that Plato in the Timaeus postulates schemata, although in fact Plato doesn't use that word, that is, the primary shapes formed by the combinations of triangles, as the causal principles of the differences between bodies, deriving all the qualitative differentiae from the differences between the basic schemata. Plato, however, says Iamblichus, would distinguish between purely mathematical schemata, which would serve as the transcendent causes of the physical shapes of bodies, and the immanent schemata, which are material and physical and involved in motion, or at least certainly geometrical. Aristotle, Iamblichus has to admit, does not here recognize immaterial or mathematical schemata as causal principles, but only immanent en matter, annular ones, which come into being with bodies and define and shape their surfaces. On the other hand, he maintains Aristotle is not declaring the shapes actually to be bodies, as do the Stoics, because Aristotle classes bodies under quantity, not under quality. Aristotle's doctrine, then, says Iamblichus, is median between that of Plato, which takes shapes as entirely immaterial, and that of the Stoics, which holds them to be material. But Iamblichus plainly feels that Aristotle is not expressing himself here with sufficient clarity, and he adduces the formulation of Archytas to throw light on what Aristotle really means. I say that it's one of his rare criticisms of Iamblichus, of Aristotle, but of course it's a standing criticism that Aristotle is really deriving from Archytas. Now, what Iamblichus thought, how he thought this worked, is slightly mysterious to me, because why would Aristotle leave out something that is plainly there in front of him in Archytas? It never occurred to him that the thing was the other way around. But anyway, that's his position. Archytas declares that this species of quality does not consist in shape, in schemata, but rather in shaping, in schematismo, indicating a distinction between the constitution of the shapes and the actual shapes in bodies. Even so, however, the shapes being dealt with here are not the original logoi, which would be analogous to the Platonic primary bodies, but those shapes which supervene upon the shaped bodies. We may note, by the way, that Iamblichus is here extracting a good deal of mileage out of Archytas' very bold statement in his page 2419 of his treatise. And of quality there are four types, is what Archytas says, diaphorai. One of them involves affection, pathos, another hexis, state, another power or potency, dunamis, and another structure or shaping, schematismos. So he uses the word. It's highly unlikely that Archytas intended any such contrast with schema, as Iamblichus is attributing to him here. Indeed, this constitutes a rather good example of Iamblichus's creative use of Archytas to buttress his intellectual interpretation of Aristotle. Philip Hoffman has actually discussed this rather well in an article which I refer to. Well, time forbids the examination of much more of Iamblichus' intellectual interpretation of the categories on the present occasion, but I feel that, in conclusion, I shouldn't neglect a topic on which Iamblichus has a good deal to say that's interesting, to wit that of time itself. Richard Sorabji has subjected Iamblichus' doctrine of time to a fascinating examination in chapter 3 of his major synoptic study, Time, Creation and the Continuum. But I think there's still something to be said more on the subject from a Neo-Platonic perspective. The question of the nature and status of time arises, of course, in connection with the discussion of the category when, which is passed over in very summary manner by Aristotle, if indeed it is Aristotle at all, at categories 11b10. The fact that Aristotle has virtually nothing to say on the subject in the categories gives commentators a free hand, which they exercise with the help of his discussion of time in the physics. Iamblichus applies to the subject the same noera theoria which he employs for the rest of the work. In all cases, he's concerned with discerning the real ousia behind the physical manifestations, employing for this purpose, as is his general policy, the insights of Archytas. Since Archytas had in all probability the benefit, as I've remarked earlier, of at least the first generation of commentary on the categories, his treatment of all the categories, including time, is more structured than that of Aristotle. And it is further influenced by the Stoic theory of categories, which presented them as unequivocally as modes of being. The when, says Archytas, 2911 Teslev, and time in general, contain as a characterizing property, idion, the invisible and the insubstantial, to ameres kai to anupostaton. He defines it as a kind of number of movement and in general the interval, diastama, of the nature of the universe. Well, Iamblichus fastens on this characterization of time as both ameres and anupostaton. The same thing, he argues, in 353.19 following, cannot be both. Since partlessness is a characteristic of real being, which is a hypostasis, so it can't be anhypostaton, Archytas must therefore be talking about two levels of time. And this gives Iamblichus the opportunity to introduce his concept of intellectual time, an archetype, as archetype of the time that we experience in the physical world. As in the case of quality and any of the other categories, Iamblichus wants to take time as manifested in this realm to be an emanation of an intellectual archetype, or form of time. This entity is not, as Plotinus would have it in 3.7.11, identical with the life of the soul, but is rather the ordering principle of the psychic realm, which measures becoming genesis. First, that of the soul, and secondly, the becoming proceeding from it. And Simplicus on the Physics, 793. It's only at this later stage that time becomes insubstantial, a continuous flow of evanescent nows. Strictly speaking, it's not even the lower or participated time that flows, but the things which participate in it. Where, he asks, should we think that the flow and shifting, the ecstasis of time occurs? We shall say, in the things that participate in time. For these are always coming into being and cannot take on that stable nature, ousia, of time, without changing, but touch that nature with ever different parts of themselves. Iamblichus is thus able to accept previous definitions of time as the measure of motion or the circuit of the heavens, or whatever, as describing, if anything, the lower level of time, which is primarily concerned with intellectual, well, he's primarily concerned with intellectual time as causal principle of this lower time. This intellectual monad of time is a rather curious entity and worth dwelling on briefly. Actually, in this case, in my earlier discussion, I engaged more at greater length with Richard and with Samuel Sambursky as to the relationship of this with MacTaggart's theory of time, which is a very interesting comparison. But of course, MacTaggart was not thinking of intellectual archetypes of time, but it's certainly interesting. Iamblichus presents this also in the Timaeus commentary, in his Timaeus commentary, fragments 63-4. In a comment on Timaeus 37d, quoted verbatim by Simplicus in his physics commentary, and also non-verbatim by Proclus. Its characteristic is to comprehend as a whole, statically and from above, in the intellectual realm, all the unending flux of physical events. It's not to be regarded as itself eternity. That position is reserved for aion, the mode of being of the intelligible realm. It might be characterized perhaps as sempiternity, by contrast with eternity. Indeed, Iamblichus is at pains to contrast it with eternity, of which it is in fact primary image. Well, even Proclus likes to make a distinction between aionios and aidios in his Timaeus commentary. It's worth bearing in mind that Iamblichus gives us a similar treatment of place, which again Simplicus characterizes as noa theoria in categories 361.7 following. As in the case of time, and indeed as in the case of quality, we must see place not just as a mere limit of bodies, but rather as an active principle descending from above, both keeping separate bodies distinct and holding individual bodies together. It's rather like what the one does with his two forces. A corporeal power which supports bodies and forces them apart, and gathers them up when they fall, and collects them together when they are scattered, at once bringing them to completion and encompassing them on all sides, to quote the rather turgid phraseology of his Timaeus commentary, fragment 90. We must see place then as a force operative at every level of the universe, up even as far as the intelligible realm. Intellect, after all, is the place of the forms. A conclusion that we may draw from Simplicus's expression at Incat 364.3, epikenon ton theon topon. Well, these then constitute a set of representative examples of the noa theoria in action. It will be seen that it is Iamblichus's purpose on the whole to salvage Aristotle, reconciling him both with his perceived doctrine elsewhere, as for example in the metaphysics and in the physics, and with that of Plato and the Pythagoreans, specifically Archytas. The aim is to establish a metaphysical framework for the interpretation of the categories, but it would be somewhat anachronistic to condemn Iamblichus too severely for that. The categories, as I observed at the outset, had been a battleground for some 300 years before his time, with virtually every phrase and every word of the text liable to challenge, and requiring defense from his supporters. It was Iamblichus's distinctive contribution, as against Porphyry, who was prepared to defend the text on its own terms as a suitable introduction to logic, to take the categories as a coherent representation of reality in the Neo-Platonic sense. And that, bizarre as it may seem to us, is not really all that more perverse than many of the various ways in which the work had been treated in the centuries before him.